My name is Swava, and before I tell you how I left my own home with just one bag, I'll just ask quietly. Leave a like, subscribe, and in the comments, tell me if an elderly woman still has the right to dignity when her family starts counting her breaths like bills. I'm not asking for mercy. Mercy is like thin soup reheated. It seems warm, but it doesn't give you strength. I just want to tell you what really happened. The house stood at the end of a short street, near Plock, where in the mornings you could hear the buses going into town first, then the neighbors, dogs, and only then people. It wasn't a palace. It had a ground floor, an upper floor, a garden with a crooked apple tree, a kitchen facing the yard, and my small room with a window overlooking the hollyhocks. But it was mine, not figuratively, not family, as those who want to have rights to everything and obligations to nothing say. Mine, bequeathed to them by my husband, paid for with my own hands, my widow's pension, my jars sold at the market for years. My son Slavomir moved in with me after marrying Dominika. He didn't have to beg for anything. He was my only child. And back then, I still believed that closeness heals the coldness that can creep between a mother and son after a father's death. From the start, Dominika was polite, so carefully, it was as if she were wrapping every word in plastic. She said, Mom, Witozha, but without warmth, more like someone trying to remember the password to someone else's door. For the first few months, everything seemed to be in order. I made soups. They did the major shopping. Sławek fixed the gutter. Dominika hung light curtains in the living room, which I didn't like, but I didn't say anything. Then her mother, Mrs. Leocadia, started coming. First for Sunday dinners, then for 2 days, then only until her leg got better. Her leg, I noticed, got worse when it was time to go back to her apartment. Leocadia took the room after my late husband. She didn't ask if she could. Dominika just said over dinner, Mommy will be most comfortable there. You don't go in there anyway. The truth was, I rarely went in, but I did. There was Antony's radio, his old work jacket, a box of buttons, and a smell that was no longer the smell of a person, but of memory. But Sławek was sitting at the table, mixing potatoes with sauce, and he didn't look up. That was the first time I felt that someone had moved a wall in my house, and I hadn't heard the bang. First, they took away my shelf in the bathroom, because Mom Leocadia has her own ointments. Then the space in the refrigerator, because Mom's products have to be kept separate. Then the silence in the afternoon, because Leocadia liked TV shows so loudly, as if she were responsible for the entire village. I gave in. Old people sometimes confuse peace with love, and I was a master at saying to myself, don't cause trouble, Witozha, for your son. Until one November morning, Dominika put a note in front of me. I was sitting in the kitchen at the table covered with a cherry-patterned oilcloth. Outside, the rain was making mud by the gate. The note was printed with neatly arranged columns. At the top she wrote, household arrangements, so there are no misunderstandings. Dominika said, adjusting the sleeve of her beige sweater. We all have to chip in. I looked at her, then at Sławek. He was standing at the sink, pretending to rinse a cup. I've been contributing ever since. I replied, easy, this is my house. Dominika smiled briefly. That's why you should understand the costs. Electricity, gas, food, Mom's medicines. Everything's getting more expensive. Sławek and I agreed that you'd pay rent for the room. I didn't understand immediately. That's the worst part of humiliation. Before it hurts, you try to make sense of it. For what room? I asked. For your room, she replied, the one by the garden. The amount is reasonable, and there's also a portion for Mom's upkeep, since you use the shared kitchen, and Mom requires a subsistence allowance. I took the note in my hand. My fingers didn't shake. That surprised me. I read the sections. Once, twice. Rent for the room. A share of the products, a share of Leocadia's medicines, a subsidy for the heating. Although I bought the wood for the stove with the money I sold from my sister Sławek's bracelets. I said quietly, did you arrange that? Quote, my son put down the cup so delicately, as if it were fragile. Mom, don't make a scene. Dominika is just tidying things up. You know how it is. I didn't make a scene. That's how I confused them. I didn't sign. Quote, Dominika pushed the note closer, tapping her fingernail next to the signature. We'll count without a signature from next month too. She announced. That'll be fair, honest. Quote, the words stood between us like a dirty mirror. I stood up, folded the note in half, and put it in my apron pocket. I have to check if the compote in the pantry has leaked, I said. Dominika rolled her eyes, but Leocadia, who was sitting in the living room under my blanket, exclaimed, old people always pretend to be poorer than they are. I didn't answer. I went to the pantry, closed the door behind me, and only then rested my forehead against the cold wall. Between the jars of 1,000 beets and pickled cucumbers, I understood something simple. They didn't want my help. They wanted me to pay for the right to silence. That same day, when everyone else was asleep, I took Antony's old folder out of the bottom drawer. There were deeds, contracts, bills, and a yellowed envelope with his handwriting written on it, in case anyone forgot whose house this was. I didn't know yet that the envelope contained a sentence that would, in time, make Dominika call me until her phone ran out of battery. And Sławek, for the first time in years, would say to me, "Mom," not out of habit, but out of fear. But then I sat in the dark kitchen with the rent note next to my tea and made a decision none of them expected of me. I wouldn't argue, I wouldn't beg. I would leave quietly. Antony's envelope was sealed with ordinary yellowed glue, but I opened it as carefully as if something living had slept inside in 1900. The person who left leaves behind no trace. Only clothes and photographs. He also leaves a voice in objects. Antony had a strict but fair nature. He didn't speak much, but when he did, you could lean a ladder on it. Inside I found a few pieces of paper, a property deed, an old extract from the land and mortgage register, bills for major roof repairs, a contract with a bricklayer to whom we paid in installments over many months, and a letter, only one page written in his uneven handwriting. Witoja, people first ask for a corner, then for a key, then say they've always been here. Don't give up your home for peace and quiet. Peace without a roof over your head is only the silence of other people. I sat at the table, and the tea cooled so much that a dull crust formed on the surface. I read that sentence several times, not because I didn't understand it, but because for the first time in a long time, someone had taken my side, although it was now just writing on paper. The next morning, Dominika came into the kitchen in her bathrobe and immediately looked at the counter. The piece of paper was gone. I put it in the flour bag, right on top of the table, at the bottom of the cupboard between the cake tins. "How? Have you thought about it?" she asked, pouring coffee into my cornflower-colored mug. She didn't like that mug. She said it was Grandma's, yet she always reached for it when she wanted to show that everything in the kitchen was already shared. I thought about it, and replied, "That's good. Sławek said you could pay by bank transfer or cash, whichever was more convenient for you." Sławek sat at the table, slicing bread. He didn't look at me. When he was a boy, he always looked straight in the eye, even when he'd done something wrong. I knew then that shame was still working within him. Now he's learned to hide behind a slice of bread, behind the phone, behind his wife. "And your mother, Dominiko, how much will she pay for Antony's room?" I asked. The knife stopped in Sławek's hand. Dominika burst out laughing, the way people swat away flies. "Please don't be mean. Mom is sick. I have bad days too. But you have a pension and a house. A house you're paying for." "I'm not paying." The kitchen fell silent. Leocadia from the living room turned down the TV, though she pretended not to listen. Dominika put down her cup. "Please be careful, because this kind of attitude destroys the family." Family? I noticed that this word was always used in our house when someone wanted me to give in. When the windows needed cleaning, I was family. When Leocadia needed to buy more expensive eye drops, I was family. When it came time to ask me if I wanted to give up my husband's room, I was an old obstacle. I didn't answer. I took a basket from the cupboard and said I was going to the market for parsley. That was also a lie, but a small one that doesn't stain my conscience. I did go to the market, but not for parsley. I went to Mrs. Yonka, who had been selling eggs for years and knew more about people's homes than many a clerk about their papers. Mrs. Yonka had a face as wrinkled as a dried pear and eyes as sharp as needles. "Witoja, today you look as if you'd been counting other people's eggs all night." "I'm to blame," she said before I could even say hello, "because maybe I was counting my silence." I replied. I didn't tell her everything, just that the house had become crowded, that my daughter-in-law wanted arrangements, that I needed to check the documents. Mrs. Yonka nodded and gave me the number of her niece, who worked at a notary's office in Plock. "Not to make a fuss, just to know. Remember," she said, putting a bunch of parsley in my basket, which I didn't buy. "If you have the papers, you don't have to shout. Shouting is for those who only have the nerve." I carried those words with me like a warm stone in my pocket. In the afternoon, when Dominika went with Leocadia to the clinic and Sławek was at work, I opened the wardrobe, not the large one everyone else used, but the small one in my room behind the curtain. I took out my travel bag from the days when Antony and I used to go to Ciechocinek. I didn't pack much. 2 sweaters, underwear, medicines, documents, a photo of Antony from his youth, and a notebook with a green cover in which I had written down household expenses for years. This notebook would later be more important than any of them had imagined. Every bill, every transfer, every furnace repair, every bag of fuel. I wrote everything down because Antony taught me so. Memory is good for prayer, but paper is less good for money, he used to say. For years, I laughed at his caution. Now I kiss the green cover like a relic. In the evening, Dominica returned irritated. Leocadia sat in the living room with the expression of a queen after a lost battle. The doctor said that Mom needed peace. She said, Dominica. So please don't start talking about money in front of her. You started it, I said, washing the dishes. Because I have to be responsible for the house. Then I slowly turned around. For whose house, Dominica? We looked at each other for a long time. In her eyes, I saw something I hadn't been able to name before. It wasn't just impudence. There was the certainty of someone who believes an elderly woman has nowhere to go, so she can be pushed around the house like an old armchair. That night I didn't sleep. I heard Sławek and Dominica talking behind the wall. They weren't shouting. A whisper is worse than a scream, because you have to guess the rest. She's getting difficult, Dominica said. Give her a few days. Sławek muttered, we don't have a few days. Mom needs a permanent place. And your mother needs to understand that she can't do it alone. Then came a sentence that took my breath away. If I sign, it will be easier. I didn't know yet what exactly I was supposed to sign. I only knew that the rent note was the beginning, not the end. I got up before dawn, when the house was breathing heavily with someone else's sleep. I dressed quietly. I took my bag, my folder for the antonym, and my green notebook. I left not a farewell letter on the table, but an envelope. Inside was their rent note without my signature and one sentence written in my hand. If I have to pay for a room in my own, I'm leaving you alone at home. For now, I'll excuse you from that expense. I locked the door from the outside with my own key. I didn't slam it, I didn't cry. I walked down the road to the bus stop, leaving the house behind me, which suddenly stopped being silent because when the bus started towards Plock, my phone started ringing for the first time. The phone rang so insistently it seemed to want to jump out of my coat pocket. I sat on the bus by the window, holding my bag on my lap, and wet fields, bus stops with crooked roofs, and people huddled under umbrellas passed by. I didn't answer. Not because I was brave, but because I was afraid to hear Sławek's voice and turn around immediately. A mother learns about a child throughout her life, but a child also learns about a mother. Sławek knew when to say, Mommy, softly, to make my knees weak. He knew how to sigh to make me feel guilty. He knew that silence was the easiest way to break me, because I always took silence upon myself as if it were my duty. That morning I decided for the first time not to take anything. When the bus pulled into Plock, my phone already had a dozen missed calls. Dominica, Sławek, Dominica, Sławek, then one from Leocadia. It almost made me laugh. The woman who had barely nodded to me in my living room for months suddenly found the strength in her finger to look for me. I got off at the station and for a moment I didn't know where to put my foot. I supposedly knew the city, had been to the doctor, to the offices, to the cemetery with my cousin Antony, but it was one thing to come for a few hours, quite another to arrive with my life in a bag. The rain was drizzling, the cold was creeping up my collar. I thought then that maybe this was freedom. Small, joyless, just wet and a little hungry. I went first to a small cafe near the station. It was called Podolak, although there were no violets there, just 2 pots of ferns and the smell of yeast cake. I ordered tea, not coffee, because coffee that day might have been too much for me. Shatter my heart into tiny pieces. I sat down at a table against the wall and took out my green notebook. On the first page, Antony had written long ago. A house begun in spring, finished when one stops being afraid of rain. Next were my notes. Roof, furnace, gutters, tiles, windows, property tax, utilities, lumber, coal, gate repair, plumber's bill. Each amount like a small nail driven into the truth. Only when I spread the papers on the table did I notice the waitress looking at me gently. Have you lost something? She asked. I think it was the other way around, I replied. I want to make sure I haven't lost anything else. She didn't ask. She brought me an extra saucer and said I could sit as long as I needed. Such a small kindness can almost knock you over, because it comes from a stranger when you've already got your place at the table. In the afternoon, I called Mrs. Yonka's niece. Her name was Surina, which immediately struck me as a name as serious as a seal. She made an appointment for me that same day at the notary's office, although she emphasized that she only works with documents and that notaries provide legal advice. I said I wasn't looking for a miracle. I was looking for someone who would read the paper without the family sighing. In the meantime, the phone rang again. This time, a message came from Sławek. Quote, "Mom, where are you? Dominika is crying. Don't be silly. Come back, we'll talk." I looked at those words for a long time. Dominika is crying. No. Do you have a place to sleep? No. Have you taken your medicine? No. I'm sorry. Only Dominika is crying. So her mother should come back and to put out a fire that someone else had started under her own roof. I replied curtly. I'm safe. I won't be back today. Immediately afterward, the phone rang. I rejected the call. The notary's office was located in an old tenement house with a heavy door. The stairs smelled of floor polish and damp paper. Syna was a woman with a calm face, wearing glasses on a thin chain. She didn't have that official superiority that sometimes makes older people cringe. She asked me to sit down, gave me water, and began leafing through her folder. Quote, "Is the house solely yours?" she asked after a moment. "I've thought so all my life, and you were right. A son isn't a co-owner, a daughter-in-law, even less so. My daughter-in-law's mother-in-law has no title here, unless you've made some kind of agreement with her." I simply remained silent. I said. Syna didn't smile, but her eyes softened. Then I showed her Dominika's card, Tiox rent for my room and maintenance. Leocadia. She read it once, very slowly, then again, more quickly. She put the paper down on the desk, like putting something dirty away but not wanting to make a noise. "Didn't you sign it?" "No." "Fine, fine." And then I asked about the sentence I'd heard through the wall. "If I sign it, it'll be easier." Syna fell silent. She asked me to remember if Dominika or Sławomir had recently mentioned guardianship, transferring the house, power of attorney, or simplifying the formalities. I immediately remembered that a few weeks ago, Dominika had said that it's easier for older people when children have access to their affairs. Sławek had mentioned that he could handle my taxes and bills. Leocadia once said that a single woman shouldn't keep everything to herself. Syna sighed. "I won't say what they planned, because I don't have proof, but I will tell you what you shouldn't do. Don't sign anything at home, at the table, when crying, when sick, or when in a hurry." That sentence I remembered it better than the office address. That evening, Mrs. Yonka called me. She didn't ask where I was, just told me that her cousin, Mrs. Bogusława, had a small room available above a former tailor's shop. Clean, modest, with a separate entrance from the courtyard. I could spend the night there and stay a few days. I accepted. Pride won't warm a man when his socks are soaked. When I arrived, it was already dark. The room had a narrow bed, a table, a kettle, and a window onto the rooftops. There were no mouths, no dresser, and the creaking of the stairs I'd known for years. But no one made me pay for the right to breathe. No one used my mug to show me I was a guest in their own life. I sat on the bed and only then listened to Dominika's voicemail. Her voice was different than it had been that morning. Not commanding, sharp with fear. "Mrs. Widosława, please call me back immediately. This isn't funny. Sławek can't find his folder. Mom isn't feeling well. Besides, she came. Some envelope from the office, and it's in your name. We can't do anything without you. Please don't act childish." I listened to the message again, not because of Dominika, because of a single word from the office. The next morning, I would learn that my quiet escape had shaken not only my family but also the paper that had been waiting in the mailbox for several days. Paper that Dominika feared more than my crying. In the morning, I rose earlier than the bells from the nearby church. It was chilly in the small room above the former tailor's shop, but not as chilly as in someone who, after years, hears from their own family that they're taking up too much space. Mrs. Bogusława left me slices of bread, butter in a small bowl, and a note on the table. Quote, "Eat on a hungry person. One forgives too quickly." I smiled at the note, though my eyes were heavy from a sleepless night. There was something truer in that sentence than in many family speeches at the table. I ate slowly, took my medication, and repacked the documents. I packed my bag, as carefully as if I were arranging the bones of my life in it. I took the bus to the municipal office. The same direction as home. I only got off earlier at a low building with a flag and a sign whose paint was peeling at the corners. Inside, it smelled of paper, wet jackets, and that official patience that can be a blessing or a punishment, depending on the window. I didn't know what I was looking for. All I had was Dominika's message and her sudden fear of the envelope. I took a number, sat against the wall, and watched the people. A young mother was adjusting her child's hat. A man in work trousers clutched a stack of forms. An elderly man was arguing in whispers with his wife about the application submission date. An ordinary day, ordinary people. And I sat with Antony's briefcase, as if carrying the last proof that he still existed. When my turn came, I found myself with a woman with blonde hair tied back with a clip. On her desk, she had a mug with the words, "Relax, these are just documents." I thought that someone who puts a mug like that in the office either has a very cheerful disposition or a very dark sense of humor. "Good morning. I'm here about correspondence in my name," I said. "My family says something from the office arrived, but I don't have it with me." The woman asked for my ID, checked something on the computer, then frowned. Not hard enough to scare me, but enough to make me feel a hard knot in my stomach. A request for additional information was sent. She said, "It concerns the waste management declaration and the number of people living in the property." Waste? I repeated. Additional people appeared on the declaration. A change has been reported. Confirmation from the owner is needed. For a moment, all I heard was the ticking of the clock. Additional people. A change has been reported. Confirmation from the owner. Who reported it? I asked. The woman hesitated. The application was submitted electronically with Mr. Slavomir's profile. It indicated that your son, daughter-in-law, and Mrs. Leocadia had recently moved into the house permanently. There was also a note about a planned change in the use of part of the building. What change? The lady looked at the screen again, then at me. Her expression became cautious. It's about separating the living area for separate use. This isn't a decision yet. Please don't get upset. We need the owner's documents, consents, a drawing of the rooms, confirmation of title. A drawing of the rooms, consents. Suddenly, I remembered Dominika walking around the house a few days earlier with a tape measure. She said she wanted to buy a new carpet for the living room and needed to check the dimensions. She wasn't measuring the carpet, she was measuring my house. Did I sign anything? I asked, even though I knew the answer. Your signature isn't in the file, so we sent a summons. My breath slowly returned. Antony was right. Paper can be a shield if you don't hand it over to someone else. I asked for a copy of the information I could get as the owner. The lady printed out a few pages and showed me where I could submit a declaration stating that I didn't consent to any changes to the property without my personal presence. I filled out the form slowly. Each letter of my name felt like a small return to myself. As I typed the address of the house, my hand stopped for a moment. Before my eyes came the apple tree by the gate, the porch with a cracked tile, the room off the garden, and then Dominika's card. What a room. A share of Leocadia's medication, a heating subsidy. I signed the declaration without a quiver. The phone rang in the hallway. This time I answered. Not because I forgave them, but because I wanted to hear what the man who measured my house would say when he thought I was only measuring silence. Mom, Sławek's voice was strained. Where are you? We're going crazy. At the office, I answered. There was a short but very meaningful silence on the other end. At which office? Where they sent me a summons. I heard a rustle, as if he'd covered the receiver with his hand. Then Dominika's distant voice. What had she said? Sławek returned to the conversation. Mom, it's not like that. Dominika just wanted to sort out the registration and fees. With a measuring tape? What? I asked if fees were measured. Measuring stick from wall to wall. Silence again, this time longer. Mom, come home. We'll talk normally. Another word that, in their mouths, meant, return to your seat, and we'll kindly change the tone. I won't be back today, I said, but this is your house. Quote, I almost laughed. The truth sounds so strange when someone who had just tried to drown it out. That's why I don't have to rush, I replied. I hung up first. It was small, but to me, it was huge. All my life I'd waited for someone to finish talking so I wouldn't seem rude. That day, for the first time, I ended a conversation when I'd had enough. From the office, I went not to the bus stop, but to the house of my neighbor, Mrs. Eulala, who lived 2 houses down from us. We didn't visit each other often, but we'd been talking over the fence for years about cucumbers, snails, and the price of sour cream. I knew she saw more than she was saying. I opened it in my woolen sweater and she let me in immediately. I knew you were coming, she said. Where? Because last night, your daughter-in-law was carrying boxes from your room into the hallway, and this morning, Mrs. Leocadia told the postman that the owner of the house was temporarily absent, but the family was managing everything. I sat down heavily at her kitchen table. What were they carrying out? Mrs. Eulalia lowered her gaze. I couldn't see everything, but one box belonged to your husband. The one marked, radio and parts. For a moment, the world went very quiet. It wasn't about the value of the box. Old lamps, screws, wires, maybe Antony's radio, which I still sometimes stroked on its casing. It was about them crossing a threshold that even impertinence shouldn't touch. Mrs. Eulalia handed me tea and added, "There's something else. Someone's coming over on Saturday to look at the rooms." Quote, I heard your daughter-in-law saying through the window that the house was large, and the owner was staying with family in the city anyway. I watched the steam rising from the mug. Then I realized that my quiet escape wasn't the end of the humiliation. It only revealed their plan. And if they wanted to make me a tenant in their own home, I had to show them something much more peaceful and menacing than screaming. That the owner would come back without asking. The owner would come back for her things and the truth. I didn't go home right away. It would be like running into the rain without a coat just because someone was shouting outside. I stayed at Mrs. Eulalia's, listening to the spoon clink against the rim of the glass, and I arranged in my head not the words of anger, but the order of things. In anger, a person can speak the truth so loudly that others only remember the tone. I needed them to remember the content. Mrs. Eulalia took a squared notebook from the cupboard and placed it in front of me. I don't want to interfere, Mrs. Witoja, she said, but I have written down when, who arrived, and what happened, just out of habit. Quote, my husband had said all his life that a neighbor's memory can be better than a boundary stone. She opened the notebook. There were dates, short notes, sometimes about the weather, sometimes about who parked by the fence. I found a post about the day Dominica first brought Leocadia home with 2 large bags, even though she said it would only be for a few days. There was a post about measuring windows. There was even a post about a conversation with a man at the gate while I wasn't home. You don't have to give it to me. I said, I won't. It shows you're not alone with your own memory. Those words warmed me more than tea. We went home together. Not because I was afraid to go in. I was more afraid that seeing my things move by other people's hands would break my heart and I'd start explaining things to them instead of protecting myself. Mrs. Eulalia's presence was like a handrail on a steep staircase. The gate was ajar. Someone had tied a piece of string to it because the lock had been stuck for a long time, and Sławek had promised to fix it in the spring. There were 2 boxes on the porch. I recognized one immediately. It was from a kettle Antony and I had bought many years ago, but I'd kept its wires in it for ages, old knobs, screws, and a small radio with a cracked dial. The box was open. On top lay Antony's jacket, folded haphazardly, like a rag ready to be carried away. I didn't cry, that came later. In that moment, I felt only a cold so pure it was sobering. I entered without knocking. This was my home. In the living room, Leocadia was sitting in an armchair under my blanket. On the table, she had a plate of cheesecake I'd baked before leaving, and the remote control balanced on her lap like a scepter. She saw me and jumped. Quote, oh, you're back, she said, but her voice wavered. Dominica said you needed rest. I needed the truth. I replied, I'll rest later. Dominica ran out of the kitchen. Her face was pale, and her hair was tied back carelessly, which, for her, meant not illness but a loss of control. Quote, where were you? She began sharply. We have responsibilities here. Mom's nervous. Sławek had to take off work, and you're putting on a show. Mrs. Eulalia stood behind me quietly but clearly. Dominica noticed her only after a moment. Quote, and you, why? She asked, neighborly. Mrs. Eulalia replied, sometimes you have to make sure you don't trip over other people's boxes. Dominica pursed her lips. I entered my room. The piranha blanket was off. On the bed was a bedspread I'd never seen before. Gray and plain, like in a rental room. The picture of Antony was gone from the nightstand. In its place stood an empty vase. My books had been moved to the bottom shelf, and some of my clothes had been stuffed in a bag by the window. On the desk, I found a printed note. A room in a quiet house outside the city. Access to the kitchen and garden for someone working or studying. The owner is elderly, away from home. Terms to be negotiated. I read this sentence slowly. The owner is elderly, away from home. Not the mother, not the housekeeper, not the woman who built this roof with her husband and then maintained it herself. The elderly owner, an inconvenient detail in the ad. Sławek followed me into the room. He looked worse than he had that morning. His face was tired, but I couldn't tell if it was shame or just fear of the consequences. Mom, Dominika went too far with this ad. He said it quietly, but she meant well. We're in a difficult situation. I turned to him. Did you also mean well when you reported the change of use to the office? He paled. Those were just formalities. The formalities the owner learns about from a summons. Mom, don't talk to me like that. How am I supposed to talk to a son who lets his wife display his mother's room like an empty cell phone? No, he replied. In his eyes, I saw a glimpse of the boy I once knew, the one who used to hide a broken mirror in his pocket and cry before I could ask. But right behind him appeared a grown man, accustomed to comfort, where a mother should be soft and a wife decisive. Dominika entered without invitation. Please don't be dramatic. The room is empty. Since you're gone, you have to pay the bills somehow. Then I took the copy of the official statement from my bag and placed it on the desk. No changes without my presence. No rent, no moving my things, no using my name in your arrangements. Dominika looked at the paper, then at Sławek. Did you know she'd handle this? Sławek remained silent. That silence was the first crack between them. A small crack. But in quiet homes, that's how walls begin to crumble. Leocadia appeared in the doorway, leaning on the cane she carried mainly when she needed to appear weak. Mrs. Widosława, we're not strangers after all. Dominika is trying. I have nowhere to go. I looked at her carefully. You have your own apartment. For a second, something flickered in her face. She lowered her gaze too quickly. It's complicated, she muttered. I remembered that. Not the answer, but that twitch. When someone tells the truth, they look differently than when they're guarding a closed drawer. I didn't take everything. I only took what I couldn't leave with my hand. The photo of Antony found under the books, the box with his radio, my expense notebook, the documents, and my mother's small embroidered handkerchief. I wrote the rest down on a piece of paper in front of Mrs. Eulalia. No, to make a play, to give each item a name. Finally, I went to the kitchen table. Dominika stood at the sink, stiff with anger. Sławek stared at the floor. Leocadia sat back in her armchair with 1900, but she didn't eat the cheesecake anymore. From today on, I said calmly, all matters concerning the house will be in writing. Not at the table, not through crying, not for the family. In writing, Dominika snorted. You're the one destroying the family. I grabbed my bag. No, Dominika, I just stopped financing the pretense that it still exists on your terms. I left, leaving the door open behind me long enough for them to see I wasn't slamming, running, or begging. On the porch, I stopped by the box for Antony. I pressed it to my chest. Only then did something catch in my throat. Mrs. Eulalia walked beside me all the way to the gate. There, she leaned down and handed me a small envelope from the ground, which must have fallen out of the box. It was addressed in Antony's hand, but not to me, to Sławek. The envelope lay light in my hand as a dry leaf, yet I felt its weight all the way to my arm. The paper was yellowed around the edges, carefully closed, with my son's name written in the same hand that Antony used to sign roofing bills, Christmas cards, and my notebook with a recipe for chokeberry liqueur for Sławek when he was old enough to talk. That's all he had written under the address. Mrs. Eulalia looked at me quizzically but said nothing. Wise people know there are questions you shouldn't ask too soon. I tucked the envelope into the inside pocket of my coat and walked on, clutching the box for the antonym. Each step away from home was a little easier, a little harder. Easier because I moved away from their faces. From Dominika standing at the sink like a guardian of someone else's kitchen. From Leocadia feigning weakness when it was necessary to avoid answering. Harder because in this house remained my curtains, my pots, my stairs, and my son, who stared at the floor when he should have been standing by me. I returned to Mrs. Boguslava's room late in the afternoon. I placed the box on the table and didn't take off my coat for a long time. The heat from the radiator reached slowly, and I sat in the chair, fingering the envelope. It wasn't mine. Honesty said, don't open it. But a mother's pain whispered, maybe the answer lies there. Why your son has become the kind of person who makes you pay for your own room? I didn't open it. I placed it on the table next to Antony's photo and said aloud, as if I were talking to him through the thin glass of the photograph. I won't be like them. I won't take other people's letters for myself. That evening, Sławek called. This time I only answered after the third ring. Quote, Mom, he said. He started differently than usual. Less sharply, more tired. Dominika says you took some of father's boxes. I took what you took out onto the porch. It wasn't like that. Everything's not right with you lately, Sławek. It's just that things are in different places. Really. He was silent for a moment. I heard Dominika's muffled voice in the background. but I couldn't make out the words. She was probably standing nearby, maybe with her arms folded, maybe with that expression she had when the shop assistant didn't immediately agree with her. Quote, "Is there something important in there?" he asked. I finally looked at the envelope. Quote, "There's a letter from father to you." The silence on the other end grew thick. "What letter?" "I don't know. I didn't open it." "It says, for you." I heard his breathing. For a moment, he was my son again. Quote, "Not Dominica's husband, not the man with the forms and measuring tape. The son who, as a boy, held his father's first penknife in his hand and pretended not to be moved." "I'll bring it to you," I said, "but not to the house. We'll meet tomorrow at the cafe by the station." "Why would you?" "You can come back." "I can, but I don't want to go back to the table where everyone speaks for me." "Mom, Dominica thinks you're making us out to be monsters." "And what do you think?" He didn't answer immediately. It was sadder than the wrong answer. "I don't know anymore," he said quietly. For the first time in a long time, I didn't try to help him with this ignorance. I didn't give him a ready-made sentence. I didn't justify it. I didn't say, "I understand, son," because maybe it was my understanding that had, over the years, provided a comfortable cushion for his conscience. The next day I came to the cafe. I had already taken a table by the wall, the same one where I had spread out the documents. I ordered tea and asked for an extra glass of water. My hands were cold, but the envelope was untouched in my bag. Sławek came in late. His coat was unbuttoned and he had the face of a man who had slept through the night but hadn't rested. He glanced around uncertainly, as if afraid someone he knew would see him with his mother outside. He sat down across from me. Quote, "Do you look okay?" he asked, though it sounded more like a question than a statement. "Better than when they told me to pay the rent for the garden room." He grimaced. "It was a mistake. A mistake is confusing sugar with salt. That was an arrangement." I took out the envelope and placed it between us. I didn't hand it to him. I wanted him to reach for it himself, to make at least one move towards the truth. He looked at his father's handwriting for a long time. Then he tore open the envelope carefully, almost reverently. He read slowly, and I watched his face change. First, he frowned, then paled. Finally, he pursed his lips, just like Antony pursed them when he didn't want to say something too harsh. "Will you read it to me?" I asked. Sławek shook his head. "Is it for me?" "I know. That's why I'm asking, not taking it." He lowered the note onto the table. For a moment, I thought he would refuse, but perhaps the weight of his father's handwriting was greater than his stubbornness. "Father wrote that the house is not a reward for being a son," he said quietly. "The house is meant to be a place for you, as long as you want to live in it. That if I ever let you feel like a tenant in it, I should first look in the mirror and ask myself if I deserved even the key to the shed." I turned my head to the window. Not because I was ashamed of the tears, but because I didn't want Sławek to take them as forgiveness. "There's something else," he added, his voice trembling. "He wrote that you saved for years for my startup, that the money from my grandmother's plot of land didn't go towards renovations, as you told me, but towards my technical school, courses, and my first apartment, which I couldn't keep up with anyway. That I shouldn't pretend I built everything myself." He closed his eyes. "I didn't know that. I didn't want you to live with debt. I said it, and I made you a debtor." "I didn't say that." He said it. And that's why it hurt the most. Then his phone vibrated. He looked at the screen and turned it over, but I saw Dominica's name. He didn't answer. A moment later, a message arrived. He read it, and his face hardened again. Only this time, not against me. "What happened?" I asked. Sławek slipped the letter into the envelope, even though it was already torn. "Dominica writes that the man from the room is coming today, so I can convince you it's just a test run." The tea in front of me was already lukewarm. I lifted the glass, took a sip, and put it down calmly. "You convinced me otherwise." He looked at I was terrified. "To what end?" "That it's time for your wife to hear the truth, not from me, but from the man she still considers her side." Sławek was silent. A bus passed by outside the window, and its reflection moved across the glass like a shadow of his former life. Quote, "Mom," he finally said, "I don't know if I can." I grabbed my purse and stood up. I too, had to learn to leave quietly, even though I'd spent my whole life returning at his beck and call. I didn't go home with him, not yet, but I left him a copy of the official statement and a single page from my green notebook. Household expenses from the last few months. Everything written down neatly, without shouting. At the bottom, I only added, "From now on, every expense and every decision has the name of the person who actually incurs them." As I was leaving the cafe, the phone started ringing again. This time it wasn't Dominica, it was Mrs. Eulalia. Quote, "Mrs. Widowshoe," she said quickly. "The man is already at the house." But the strangest thing wasn't that. Mrs. Leocadia had just said at the gate that her apartment wasn't empty at all. She was renting it to someone else. I stopped on the sidewalk, so I had nowhere to go. It was supposed to be, but not mine. Mrs. Eulala's words cut through me quietly but deeply, like a splinter under a fingernail. I stood on the sidewalk in front of the cafe, my purse pressed to my side, staring at the wet flagstones over which people walked, unaware that one of someone else's lives had just collapsed. Leocadia had nowhere to go. That's what she said at my table. Under my blanket, with my cheesecake on a plate. That's how she looked at me with moist eyes when she wanted me to give her the room back after the Antony, and then she'd even pay for her medicine. Meanwhile, her own apartment wasn't empty. She was working, earning money, but the money was going somewhere I wasn't allowed to look. Mrs. Eulala, I said slowly. Did she say it clearly? It couldn't have been any clearer, the neighbor replied. The man at the gate asked if the old lady was really staying home because he didn't want to get involved in family quarrels, and Mrs. Leocadia replied that she had to stay because she'd rented her apartment to decent people and wouldn't be kicking them out overnight. I closed my eyes. Decent people. Other people's tenants deserved peace, but I wasn't even entitled to my own room. Had Sławek heard that? No, he wasn't here yet. Dominika, however, had heard and immediately told my mother to come inside. I knew I should feel triumphant, but I felt exhausted. A lie, when exposed, doesn't always bring relief. Sometimes it only shows how long someone has allowed themselves to be starved of crumbs of truth. I didn't go to the house right away. I called Sławek. He answered quickly, as if waiting for a verdict. Quote, Mom, your mother-in-law is renting her apartment. I heard a sharp intake of breath on the other end. What's that? What are you hearing? She's not homeless. She wasn't left without a choice. She has an apartment from which she's withdrawing money. While your wife made me pay for a room in my house to support her mother. Sławek was silent for so long that for a moment I thought the connection had broken. Did you know before? He finally asked, his voice sounding strange, as if he wasn't asking me, but himself. No. And you? No. He said it quietly. Dominika said the apartment was in bad shape, that it needed renovation, that my mother couldn't go back there. It might need renovation, but it wasn't so necessary that someone would pay for it. I didn't add anything more. I didn't need to. There are sentences that drag the rest behind them like a wet coat. I'm going home. He said. Don't go there to scream. Why should I go? Right, and to decide whether you'll continue standing in the middle, pretending the middle is an honest place. I hung up and only then headed for the bus stop. The bus dragged through the city, then through the gray suburbs, and I sat with my hands folded over my bag. Small scenes came flooding back to me that I had previously dismissed as coincidences. Leocadia answering the phone on the porch, always in a whisper. Dominika closing her laptop as I entered the kitchen. Their conversations about expenses, which never mentioned income. When I reached the gate, I saw a strange man standing by the steps. He was middle-aged, in a clean jacket, with a briefcase under his arm. He looked more like a teacher than someone looking for a cheap room. He greeted me politely. Quote, Are you the owner? He asked. Yes, Widow Sława. He nodded with relief. Quote, It's good you came, because your daughter-in-law said everything was settled, but I had my doubts from the start. I don't want to rent anything without the consent of the person who owns the house. Dominika must have seen me through the window, because she ran out almost immediately. Please don't talk on the threshold, she said to the man, and at me she gave a look as sharp as a bread knife. This is a misunderstanding. We're sorting it out now, I replied. The man took a step back. Thank you. I won't participate in what looks like a family dispute. It's not a dispute, Dominika said quickly. My mother-in-law has simply been unsettled lately. The word rang out in the yard like a slap. Unsettled. I didn't scream. I didn't raise my hand, just looked at the man and handed him a copy of my statement from the office, the one I had in my bag. Quote, Please see. There's no rental. The ad wasn't mine. The room is mine. The house is mine, and I'm conscious enough to say so. The man read it quickly, handed it back to me, and bowed slightly. I apologize, ma'am. I wish you peace. He walked away, his footsteps on the gravel sounding like the first small consequence. Not public humiliation, not a brawl, simply someone else's lie hadn't found a tenant. Dominika stood there, her face pale. Quote, Are you happy? She hissed. Because of your stubbornness, we lost money. You didn't lose money. You didn't make it on my room. Then Leocadia emerged from the house without her cane. She realized too late, because our eyes met over the threshold. For a brief moment, she stood straight, her face probably firm and completely unsick. Then, as if remembering her role, She bowed her back and caught herself. Quote, "Does the door frame feel bad?" She groaned. "Do you feel like this in your apartment too?" I asked. Dominica turned abruptly. Quote, "Mom, come inside. Let her stay," I said. "I want to hear why I had to pay for her upkeep when she earns rent." Leocadia pursed her lips. Dominica took a step toward me, but Sławek's voice stopped her. Quote, "I want to hear it too." He was standing by the gate. I didn't know when he'd arrived. He had a torn envelope from Antony in his hand. He wasn't looking at me, but at his wife. Dominica paled even more. Quote, "Sławek, not now, right now." Those were just 2 words, but I heard something in them I hadn't heard from him in ages. Spine. Leocadia was the first to look away. "Those are my private matters," she said. "And wasn't my house my private matter?" I asked quietly. No one answered. Sławek entered the yard and stood beside me. He didn't touch my arm, didn't make a grand gesture, simply stood on the side of the gravel I was standing on. Dominica said slowly, quote, "Did you know about Mom's apartment being rented?" Dominica looked at him the way you would look at someone who's betrayed a prearranged scene. I wanted to help us. Who helped us? The question was small, but it struck the very heart of the house, because suddenly it became clear that we weren't family. We were Dominica and Leocadia, and the rest were supposed to pay for their peace of mind. I went inside first, not for permission. For my expense book, which I'd left a copy of on the table the day before. I wanted them to see something else. Not just their lie, but my years. I placed the green notebook on the kitchen table, next to it the rent slip Dominica had given me that rainy morning. "If you like settlements," I said, "we'll start settling them honestly. Not with money, because I won't get all of that back, and that's not the most important thing. We'll settle the truth. Who lived for free? Who paid? Who pretended to be sick? Who measured someone else's room? And who made the landlady pay for breathing under her own roof?" Leocadia sat down heavily in her chair. Dominica turned her face to the window. Sławek stared at the notebook. As if for the first time he saw that my life had columns, sums, and dates, not just patience. Then it rang. Dominica's phone. She didn't answer. On the screen next to me, the name written as the tenant flashed, and I realized the truth didn't end with the rent. She was just opening the door to the next room. Dominica's phone rang for a moment, buzzing on the kitchen table between my green notebook and the rent slip. It seemed like an ordinary sound, yet we all stared at the phone as if it were about to stand up and say what we hadn't dared to say. Dominica regained her composure first, reaching for the phone, but Sławek placed his hand on the table. Quote, "Leave it," he said. He didn't shout, he didn't have to. There was something new in his voice, hard, and alien even to me. Dominica looked at him incredulously. Quote, "What are you doing? I want to know who's calling." "The tenant, you see. The tenant who's..." Leocadia began to cough. Not like a sick person coughs, but like someone trying to cover up a hole in a conversation with noise. Over the years, I've seen all sorts of women's ways of avoiding the truth. Some were adjusting their clothes, others were searching for their glasses. Still others suddenly felt unwell. Leocadia chose coughing. "Mom, have a drink of water," Dominica said, not taking her eyes off Sławek. "Leocadia, please answer first," I said calmly. "If the apartment is hers, the tenant is probably her business too. You have no right to interfere with my affairs." Quote, Leocadia clicked. "And you had the right to live in my husband's room and let me pay for your upkeep?" Sławek took Dominica's phone. He didn't unlock it, just held it, as if testing its weight. "Password," he said. Dominica let out a short laugh, but it wasn't a laugh, it was reflexes. "Are you crazy? I don't want to read your private stuff. I want to see messages from the person who pays for your mother's apartment, while my mother was supposed to pay rent in her own house. You won't interrogate me in my own kitchen." Quote, the sentence hung in the air. In my own kitchen. Dominica said it so quickly that it took a moment to realize what she'd said. I looked at the cabinets Antony and I had chosen after a long haggling session at the furniture store. At the tiles a neighbor had glued together using jars of pickles and a few banknotes. At the table where my son ate soup after school, cried over his first D in math, and swore he'd never leave me. The kitchen was mine, not because I had the paper. It was mine, because every board knew my hands. Sławek heard it too. His face twitched. "This isn't your kitchen," he said slowly. "And I think that's the problem." Dominica took a step back. Leocadia sank into a chair, now without coughing. I stood at the table and felt the old widowsława, the one who apologized for other people's inconveniences, slipping further and further away from me. The phone buzzed again, this time with a short message. The screen lit up on the table as Sławek put the phone down. There was no need to unlock anything to see the beginning of the text. Mrs. Dominika, is your mother's apartment flooded as always, but please confirm the contract. I didn't read any more. I didn't need to. Sławek read just as much and suddenly looked as if someone had opened a window on him in the middle of winter. As always, he repeated. Dominika snatched the phone from the table. This is out of context. Is your mother's apartment out of context? You don't understand. Quote, I had to sort things out somehow. Mom can't handle the formalities. Leocadia raised her head. What do you mean, overpaid? She asked quietly, and that was the second twist of the day. I looked at her and saw that her surprise wasn't feigned. It was real, ugly, and sudden. Dominika glared at her mother as if trying to silence her with a single look. Mom, please. How do you mean overpaid? Dominika repeated. You said the tenant was overdue. That's why I have to stay here, because nothing has come from my apartment yet. Sławek leaned his hand on a chair. In an instant, the layout of the kitchen changed. Until then, I had been standing opposite them. Now Dominika's lie had spread to the sides and affected her own mother as well. Leocadia was both guilty and deceived. This didn't make her innocent towards me, but it showed that in a home, other people's manipulations can feed on anyone, even those who came to collect other people's belongings. Dominika tightened her fingers around the phone. I did it for us. For whom? Us? Sławek asked. She didn't answer. Then Leocadia straightened slowly. She no longer looked sick. She looked like an old woman who had suddenly realized that her own child had treated her like an argument, not a mother. How much was it? She asked. Dominika averted her face. No. How much now? Sławek pulled Antony's envelope from his pocket and placed it next to my notebook. Then he said something I'd never heard him say before. Now everything will be now, because we'd been putting off the truth until it began to stink throughout the house. I sat down, my legs suddenly feeling weak, not from triumph, but from regret. I was witnessing a breakdown I hadn't wanted, even though I was the one who finally pulled back the curtain. Dominika began to speak, at first chaotically, then increasingly quietly. She had rented Leocadia's apartment through a friend. The tenant paid regularly. Some of the money was supposed to go towards renovating the place, some for medicine, some for shared needs. In practice, it went into Dominika's account. She used them to pay overdue payments for appliances, groceries for her mother, a makeup bag, gas, some old debts Sławek had no idea about. And when money began to run out, she invented my rent. My room was supposed to plug the hole in her lie. Sławek listened, his face as gray as ash. Leocadia wept quietly, but it didn't move me as it should have. Her tears were real, but belated. When she took over the room after Antony, my tears didn't interest her. Witosława, she said suddenly, for the first time without you, sharp as a fence. I didn't know she was making you pay for me. Quote, I looked at her. But you knew you took over my husband's room. She lowered her head. Yes, and you knew she had a place to return to, even if it was inconvenient. She didn't answer. That was enough. I got up from the table and took the rent slip. I spread it out in front of Dominika. I will never sign this. But today you will sign something for me. Quote, Dominika raised her eyes, filled with anger and fear. What now? I took the blank piece of paper from my purse that the woman at the office had given me when I asked for a simple declaration form. I set it down beside it. You will write that without my consent, you advertised a room for rent, moved my belongings, and tried to establish fees for my use of my room. You will also write that your mother owns an apartment, which is rented without frills, without crying, with her own hand. You have no right to force me. I won't force you. You can refuse. Then, starting tomorrow, all our conversations will be conducted exclusively by letter, and you and your mother will be given a deadline to leave my house. Calm, reasonable, but real. Sławek looked at me as if he wanted to say something, perhaps pleading, perhaps pacifying. He didn't. Dominika picked up a pen. She wrote for a long time, unevenly, with pauses. Each word came out like a thorn. Leocadia stared out the window. Sławek stood next to the sideboard, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel small at my own table. When Dominika finished, she handed me the note without a word. I read it carefully. One sentence was missing. Add that you apologize for calling me unstable in front of a stranger. Her eyes flashed. That's too much. No, that's borderline. Quote, she added it. I put the statement in my folder for the antonym. Then I took the green notebook and looked at Sławek. Tomorrow I'll come get the rest of my things from my room. Not to disappear. To decide for myself what will go back where it belongs. Quote. As I was leaving, I heard Leocadi Widosława's voice behind me. I really don't have anywhere else to go now. I stopped in the doorway but didn't turn around. So, for the first time in your life, please tell your daughter the truth, instead of trading someone else's old age for your own roof. And when I closed the door behind me, I already knew I wouldn't be returning alone the next day, because there are things that need to be carried out of the house in the presence of a witness, and there are things that need to be brought back in the presence of someone who remembers what dignity looked like before it was covered with someone else's blanket. The next morning, the sky hung low, as if it wanted to peer into my house and see how much truth could still fit under the old roof. Mrs. Boguslawa brewed me cereal coffee and didn't ask questions. She simply handed me a cotton bag with a few slices of bread and said, "You go straight to your own, Mr. Witos, even if your feet remember being turned around." I took the bag, the folder for the antonym, and the note written in Dominika's hand. Not because I wanted to wave it like a flag, the paper was supposed to lie still, but be close by. Just like a bread knife, it's not meant to frighten. And yet, it's good to have it in the kitchen when you need to cut a tough crust. Mrs. Eulalia was waiting outside the house. She wore a dark coat and a polka-dot scarf. She held her own squared notebook in her hand, the one with dates and observations. Sławek stood next to her. This surprised me. I hadn't asked him to come. He looked like he'd been working on something heavy all night and hadn't yet figured out where to put it. Quote. "Mom," he said, "I want to be there when you take my things out, when no one says you're overreacting." It wasn't, "I'm sorry, not yet," but it was like removing your hand from my mouth. We entered the house together. In the hallway stood my boxes, already closed, labeled in someone else's handwriting. Old things, books, the elders' clothes. I stopped at that last sign, the elders' clothes. Not my name, not my mother's, not Mrs. Widosława, the elders. As if, after a while, a person ceased to be a person and became a period to be tidied up. Dominika emerged from the kitchen. Her face was pale, but her hair was carefully combed, as always when she intended to pretend she had control over the situation. Quote, "You could have let me know what time you were coming," she said. "I told you yesterday I'd be coming today." That's not an answer. It's just not the kind that gives you control. Sławek looked at his wife. Dominika didn't comment. It sounded calm, yet firm. She flinched. It was obvious that in this house, I wasn't the only one accustomed to his silence. She, too, was standing on it as if it were a comfortable stool. Leocadia wasn't in the living room. The cat had been neatly folded from the armchair. The cake plate had disappeared. For a moment, I thought she might have returned to her apartment, but a rustling sound came from Antony's room. I entered without knocking. The room was almost empty from my memory, but full of unfamiliar trinkets, creams, newspapers, Leocadia's slippers, a small mirror, a bag of medicines that sat on Antony's radio, as if his silence were just an extra shelf. Leocadia was sitting on the bed, without her cane, holding a folded petticoat in her hand, and staring at the floor. "She's packing," she said it before I asked. Dominika came in behind me abruptly. Quote, "Mom, I told you you don't have to today." "I have to," Leocadia replied. There was something fragile in her voice, but this time not theatrical. She looked at her daughter not like an accomplice, but like a mother who had just seen a stranger in front of her child. Quote, "Yesterday I called the tenant," she said. "He knew almost nothing. You signed the agreement as the contact representative, not as the owner. But it was enough for him to trust that everything was fair. He transferred money to your account because you said I didn't have a head for banking, and you told me he was behind." Dominika pursed her lips. "I did it to help us. You didn't help me. You made me a burden by forcing me into someone else's house and lying in my own apartment." The words hit the room harder than a scream. Sławek stood in the doorway, Mrs. Eulalia behind him, and I felt a strange, unwanted sadness. Leocadia was guilty towards me, but now she was savoring what she'd previously served me without a blink, dependent on someone else's version of the truth. Quote, "You're not staying with me," I said quietly to Leocadia. "I won't take that back. But you can pack your things calmly. No one will take your things out onto the porch." She glanced at me quickly. A shame that hadn't been there before appeared in her eyes. Quote, "Thank you," Dominika whispered. She turned to me. Quote, "Now you'll pretend to be noble." "I won't be what I lacked in this house. Decent." She didn't answer. Perhaps because, for the first time, decency wasn't on her side as decoration, but as a requirement. I walked into my room from the garden. Inside, it smelled of unfamiliar laundry detergent. Boxes of my belongings lay on the bed. I opened the first books, tossed crookedly. Among them, a photo of my mother, bent at the corner. In the second box, tablecloths, napkins, and a few letters from Antony tied with a ribbon. The third was the heaviest: old albums, a hand-embroidered table runner, a small box with Antony's wedding ring, which I didn't wear because my hands were swelling, but always kept by my bed. The box was open, the ring missing. I didn't say anything right away. Sometimes you feel lost faster than you can name it. I ran my hand along the bottom of the box, then under the napkins, empty between the photos. Quote, Sławek, I said calmly, though my ears were starting to buzz. Call Dominika. She came reluctantly. What now? I picked up the box. Where is Antony's wedding ring? Her face gave nothing away. Too little of anything, too carefully. How should I know? Mrs. Eulalia entered the room and stood against the wall. I saw Mrs. Dominika carrying a small box to the kitchen yesterday. She said, quote, I don't know if that was it, but it was burgundy. Dominika turned abruptly. Are you following me? I don't have a window. Sławek looked at his wife. He didn't ask me if I was sure. He didn't ask me not to make a scene. He looked at her like someone looking at a crack in the wall they noticed too late. Dominika said, odd. I don't have any wedding ring. Leocadia then spoke from the kitchen. She was standing in the doorway, holding her bag. Quote, here. You put it in the sugar bowl when one told you not to touch the deceased's belongings. You said it was only for a moment, because the old lady loses everything. A silence fell in the room, so complete that I could hear the dripping of the bathroom faucet. Dominika's gaze darted from one of our faces, as if searching for a single crack through which to escape. She found none. She went into the kitchen. She returned a moment later and tossed the ring, wrapped in a paper towel, into my hand. It didn't fall. I managed to clench my fingers. It wasn't valuable to the pawnbroker. It was my entire marriage, locked in a small, worn circle. Quote, get out of my room, I said to Dominika. She looked at me in disbelief. Quote, what? Out of my room? From my boxes, from my grief? Get out. I didn't shout. And that's why she listened. When I was alone in the middle of the room, Sławek approached me slowly. Quote, Mom, not me now. He stopped. But I want to apologize. I turned the wedding ring over in my fingers. Apologies are like bread, Sławek. They're good when you're hungry, but if someone kicked you out of the kitchen earlier, bread alone won't fix the door. He bowed his head. Later, in Mrs. Eulalia's and Leocadia's presence, I wrote down all the things I'd taken, not to keep a record of suffering, but to ensure that no trifle could ever disappear into someone else's. I don't know. Quote, Leocadia signed as a witness. Her hand was shaking, but she signed. Finally, I went into the room to get the antonym, took the bag of Leocadia's medicines off the radio, and wiped the casing with my sleeve. Then I placed a photo of my husband and his wedding ring in a small bowl from Była Sławek next to it. Are you going back to your place? I whispered. I didn't know if I was talking to the ring, Antony, or myself. As I was leaving, I saw Sławek on the stairs. He was holding a piece of paper advertising the room. It was torn in half. That's some real paper, I said. I know. And the rest? He glanced toward the kitchen, where Dominika was talking quickly on the phone. Probably to someone she still knew how to present herself as the wrong party. The rest would be harder, he said. I nodded. The truth usually doesn't fit in a single day. And then Dominika's words came from the kitchen, spoken too loudly, too nervously. No, you can't come here because your mother-in-law has ruined everything. Please don't send anything to the house address. Quote, Sławek paled. I also realized that the tenant wasn't the only thing forbidden from sending to my address. Dominika's words stopped us all like a sudden creak of stairs in the night. Please don't send anything to the house address. In the house in Tysonsili, where for years the postman had known my name better than some relatives, my address suddenly became a place to avoid. Not because it was inconvenient, but because it might bring the truth. Dominika turned and saw us in the kitchen doorway. She still held the phone to her ear, but her fingers had turned white. I'll call you back. She quickly dropped it and ended the call. Sławek stood next to me as stiffly as if someone had driven a board into his back. Who's not supposed to send anything? He asked. It's a private matter. In this house, too many things were private at other people's expense. Quote, Dominika gave a short laugh, but there was not even a shred of confidence in it. Are you really going to investigate your mother and the neighbor now? Mrs. Eulalia adjusted her scarf under her chin. I can leave if you're embarrassed to tell the truth in front of witnesses. Dominika glared at her. Leocadia, who had been sitting by her bag in the hallway, raised her head. She looked tired, perhaps for the first time, truly. She didn't speak, but there was anticipation in her face. As if she, too, understood that her daughter held more strings in her hands than she'd ever shown anyone. Dominika, Sławek said, I'm asking one last time. Calm down. Who called? A company. What company? For a loan. The word fell on the kitchen table between us, heavier than all my jars I'd carried to the pantry in the fall. Alone, it seemed like an ordinary thing. People take it, pay it back, sometimes they stumble, but in Domenica's mouth it sounded like a basement door, behind which dampness had long lingered. Sławek slowly sat down. What loan? Domenica was silent. For whom? He added more quietly. The question made my hands go cold, because suddenly I saw that rainy morning before me, the rent card, its neat columns, and the space for my signature. I heard the whisper again behind the wall. If I sign, it'll be easier. Domenica, I said, surprised by the peace of my own voice. Was this loan supposed to be secured by my house? She looked at me so fiercely that the answer came faster than words. Sławek buried his face in his hands. He didn't whisper, say no. It wasn't like that, she exploded. Nobody wanted to take the house from you. I just wanted to have my paperwork in order. If you had signed a power of attorney, we could have combined the liabilities, paid everything off in one installment, and been able to breathe normally. Whose liabilities? I asked. She didn't answer. Leocadia rose from her chair. Quote, Domenica, what liabilities? Her daughter looked at her mother with almost childish anger. Yours too. Medicines, groceries, travel, repairs. Everything was on my shoulders. Quote, my apartment was making money, Leocadia said, her voice breaking. I didn't know you were taking this money because you would have squandered it. On what? On your own property in your own apartment? That sentence stung me strangely, reflecting my own humiliation in another mirror. Leocadia wasn't innocent. She'd entered my house with the comfort of someone who enjoys the silence of others, but now she stood before her daughter, stripped of confidence, with the same helplessness I'd felt at the kitchen table. Sławek raised his head. Quote, how much? Domenica pursed her lips. No, how much now? She didn't answer. Then he did something I hadn't expected him to do yesterday. He stood up, went to the sideboard, and pulled out a binder of bills. The one that always sat on the bottom shelf. He opened it on the table. Among the electricity and gas bills were copies of contracts, printouts, and letters from companies whose names I didn't recognize. Some in Domenica's name, some in Sławek's, which he clearly didn't know, because he paled at one document, and Mrs. Eulalia instinctively moved her chair toward him. Quote, that's my signature, he asked. Domenica lowered her eyes. There was no need to shout. The silence was more terrifying. Quote, you signed the consent form electronically once, she said. After all, I told you it was for the council for the refrigerator. And what was that for? She didn't answer. I looked at the documents and felt a hot, yet cold, vengeance rising within me. The kind that doesn't want to destroy a person, only to take away their instrument of harm. Quote, today ends the use of my house as a spare wallet, I said. Domenica raised her eyes. Quote, you don't understand anything. Without this money, everything will fall apart. What you built on someone else's backs won't fall apart. I took the statement I'd written the previous day from my briefcase, the official copy, and my green notebook. I laid everything neatly on the table. Quote, Sławek, you will call this company and ask them to send all correspondence only to the people covered by the contracts. Not to my address as a point of pressure. Domenica will write another statement stating that she does not and never has had my consent to use the house, my name, or my signature in any financial matters. Leocadia will write that her apartment is rented and that the income from it is not my responsibility. Domenica slammed her hand on the table. You will not dictate to me. I will, I said quietly. In my house, I will dictate the boundaries. Sławek looked at me. His eyes held something between shame and relief, as if he had been waiting for years for someone to say a sentence he was afraid to form himself. Quote, I will, he said. Domenica turned to him. Quote, are you choosing her? He didn't answer immediately. He looked at the rent note, at Antony's torn letter, at my wedding ring lying in the bowl. He didn't say it in the end. Quote, I choose the end of lies. And you become so accustomed to it that you call every truth a betrayal. Domenica slumped in her chair. For the first time, she didn't look like a housewife. She looked like someone who had suddenly discovered that the door she was about to escape through led to the same room. I felt no joy. I felt a calm so sharp it almost hurt. That afternoon, Sławek made a phone call in front of me. He spoke matter-of-factly. Sometimes he clenched his jaw. Sometimes he asked me to repeat myself. He wrote down case numbers, dates, amounts. All the numbers sounded like stones being thrown into a bowl. Domenica sat next to me, pale and silent. Leocadia signed her statement with a hand so trembling that the ink spilled at the end of her name. When we finished, I took my cornflower print mug from the kitchen. I washed it myself, thoroughly, as if washing up could remove someone else's pride from porcelain. Then I poured myself some tea and sat down at the table. Quote, I'm not coming back here tonight yet, I announced. But from now on, no one is taking my things, no one is renting my rooms, and no one is opening my letters. Tomorrow we'll talk about the move-out date. Leocadia closed her eyes. Dominika stared at the counter. Sławek only nodded. As I was leaving, Mrs. Eulalia handed me her coat. On the threshold, my son's voice stopped me. Quote, "Mom, my father wrote another sentence in the letter." I turned around. What? Sławek swallowed. That if I ever lose my way to you, I should start by returning the keys, which I haven't been able to respect. He took his bunch of keys out of his pocket and placed them on the small cabinet by the door. I didn't take them right away. I stared at them for a long time, because sometimes the loudest apology is metal clanging against wood. I didn't touch the keys right away. They lay on the cabinet by the door, heavy with meaning, even though they were only metal. The larger one with the blue cover opened the gate. The small one, slightly crooked, fit the pantry. The one with the round head was for the front door, made by Antony from Mr. Felix, who had a locksmith shop next to the bakery. Sławek looked at me as if waiting to see if I would accept his remorse in its entirety, in one go. But I already knew that remorse wasn't a package to be received. Remorse is a journey, and sometimes a person only shows on it whether they truly know how to walk. Leave them, I said. Let them lie there. Pain flickered across his face, but he didn't protest. That's good. In the past, every pain he felt immediately became my responsibility. Now I was learning that an adult son could bear the burden of his own actions without a mother's pillow under his knees. I returned to the gate with Mrs. Eulalia. I didn't look back, though I felt the eyes of the entire house on my back. Houses see differently than people do, not with their eyes, but with the creak of boards, the shadow of a curtain, the smell of boiling water. My house watched me like someone unsure whether it had been abandoned or just begun to be rescued. The night at Mrs. Boguslava's was restless. I tossed and turned in the narrow bed, and in my head I heard the metal of keys clanging against the wood. It wasn't the sound of victory, more like the closing of an old drawer where bills for other people's sins had been kept for years. In the morning, I went to the office where Surina worked. Not to unleash a storm, but to give shape to my peace. Surina listened carefully. She spread out my statements, Dominika's note, Leocadia's transcript, and the copy from the office before her. She didn't shake her head. She didn't say how they could, because that wouldn't solve anything. She simply took out a blank piece of paper and started explaining how to write a notice to clean up the household situation. You have the right to set a deadline for people living with your consent to vacate the house, but you are withdrawing that consent. She spoke best matter-of-factly, without insults, without emotion. The less anger in the letter, the harder it is to ignore it. I like that sentence. The less anger, the harder it is to ignore. My whole life I thought that if I don't scream, it means I don't have the strength. Or maybe the most enduring strength is speaking quietly and leaving a copy. We wrote a letter to Dominika and Leocadia. Sławek, as my son, received a separate one, not the same one. I didn't tell him to leave overnight because I didn't want to punish for the sake of punishing, but I made it clear that the house was no longer their place of decision, but mine, and that anyone who wanted to stay there, even for a short time, had to respect my boundaries, my room, my belongings, and my right to peace and quiet. I set a time for Leocadia to return to her own affairs, and for Dominika, a time to find a place outside my home. If she can't live without ruling over someone else's life. As I signed the papers, I didn't feel a tremor. I thought of that morning when Dominika handed me the rent slip and tapped her fingernail next to the signature line. How certain she was that the older woman would sign anything, just to avoid being called difficult. Now I signed, not under duress, on my own initiative. In the afternoon, I returned home alone. I didn't want to always go with someone, as if I needed witnesses to have the right to leave. I had the papers in my purse, and in my pocket, Antony's handkerchief, the one I'd found in the radio box. The soft cotton under my fingers gave me courage in a way I couldn't explain to anyone. Everyone was sitting in the kitchen, Dominika at the table, stiff and pale, Sławek at the window, Leocadia with her bag next to the chair, as if she'd been practicing leaving all morning but hadn't yet mastered the act. I placed the papers on the table. Please read and sign the receipt. Quote, Dominika snorted. Now you'll be a clerk in your own family, not an owner in your own home. Sławek took his copy first. He read it slowly and carefully. Then he signed the receipt without a word. Leocadia only read the first page. Then she asked her daughter for her glasses, even though she had them hanging around her neck. Finally, she signed. Dominika didn't want to. I won't sign anything that makes me an intruder. A signature. It confirms that you've read it, not that you like it. And what if I don't sign? Mrs. Eulalia saw me come in. Serena has a copy. I can send it by certified mail. You'll just make the paper longer. That's not true. Sławek looked at his wife. Sign. There was no request in those words. Dominika grabbed the pen and signed so hard that the dot at the end of her name pierced the paper. Then something I didn't expect happened. Leocadia stood up, walked over to me, and pulled a folded envelope from her pocket. Quote, "This is for you," she said. "Some of the money I had on me. Not much. I'll have to get the rest back from my daughter, if I get it back at all. But for food, electricity, for this room. I don't want to leave as if I'd just taken it." I didn't take it right away. I looked at the envelope, then at her face. I saw shame in it, but also a hint of the former comfort, still trying to find a seat. "This won't buy you forgiveness," I said. "I know. And you won't stay here much longer because of it." "I know." Only then did I accept the envelope. Not because money could compensate for the humiliation. I accepted it because sometimes a person needs to be allowed to give back even a small part of what they took, so they no longer have the excuse of not being able to do anything. Dominika looked at her mother with a mixture of anger and betrayal. "Are you against me too?" Leocadia closed her eyes. "Not against you, against what came out of you when everyone else gave in." Those words hurt Dominika more than my writings. I know, because she turned her face to the window, just as Sławek had done in the cafe when he read his father's letter. That evening, I took my cornflower print mug, Antony's wedding ring, and some clean sheets to the garden room. I didn't stay overnight, but for the first time since leaving, I opened the window and let in some fresh air. The curtains weren't up yet. Dust lay on the windowsill. The room looked like someone who had been ill. Pale, but alive. Sławek stood in the doorway. "Can I do something?" I wanted to say, "Naku, too late," but that would have been easy and not entirely true, so I pointed to the boxes. Quote, "Arrange the books. By author, not by size. Your father always argued with me about that." He nodded and began arranging them. Clumsily, carefully. I watched for a moment as he picked up my old volumes. As he blew the dust from the spines, as he stopped at the cookbook with Antony's notes. I didn't forgive him, but I allowed him to do his first honest work in this room. Just as I was about to leave, Dominika appeared in the hallway. She was pale, makeup-free, as if her face had finally grown tired of pretending. Quote, "Mrs. Widosława," she said. "I know you think you've won." I turned calmly. "I haven't won." I regained the threshold. She smiled crookedly. Quote, "You don't know everything yet." Sławek froze, book in hand. "What does that mean?" Dominika looked at him, then at me. "It means that before you all declare me the sole culprit, you should ask why I was so afraid that letters wouldn't arrive at this address." There was no pride in her voice anymore, only fear, and I suddenly realized that the last closed drawer in this house wasn't hers at all. Dominika stood in the hallway, and for a moment I saw her not as an adversary, but as a woman whose own lies were beginning to crumble underfoot. I didn't feel sorry for her, it was simple. Pity is too easy when someone has lived so long at someone else's expense. But I felt that the truth she held might be more ugly than comfortable. "Speak," Sławek said. Dominika looked at him strangely, not like a wife carrying a bag for another person, but rather like someone who's spent years carrying a bag for another person and suddenly wants to throw it on the ground, even though she knows everything inside will shatter. "Not in front of her," she said. "We don't have conversations like that in my house anymore," I replied calmly. Because of them, my things were moved in front of her, my rooms were measured, and I was made to pay for my own bed. Dominika tightened her fingers on the sleeve of her sweater. Quote, "Fine, if you want. Letters couldn't come here because some were for Sławek." My son paled. Quote, "To me?" "Yes, to you. Only you didn't read them. Because it was easier to say I was exaggerating than to look at your own affairs." Silence fell. Sławek put the book back on the box. He did so carefully, as if the spine of the old volume might fall apart from too much force. Quote, "What affairs?" he asked. Dominika laughed mirthlessly. Quote, "You really don't remember those temporary arrears of yours? Old installments, a guarantee for a coworker. That workshop equipment that was supposed to be returned. Your silence when the first letter arrived, and then the second. I started shifting the money around so it wouldn't seem like the man in this house had no control over anything except his remote control and his shame." Sławek opened his mouth but said nothing. I felt something settle inside me. It wasn't a sharp surprise, more like a bitter confirmation. I'd always felt that in their marriage, Dominika pushed everything before her like a cartload of stones, mistaking power for the right to trample on others. Now it turned out that not all the stones were hers. Quote, "That doesn't justify paying my mother's rent," Sławek said quietly. "It doesn't justify it," she admitted. "But you weren't an innocent child in the bank either. When I said we needed to find extra money, you didn't ask where. When I said your mother had a house and a pension, you didn't interrupt me. When I carried out her boxes, you looked at the floor because it was more convenient for Dominika to be the only one to blame." Those words hit him hard. They hit me too. Not because Dominika said them clearly. She spoke with anger, to share the burden. But sometimes the truth comes out even from mouths that have previously lied. "Where are those letters?" I asked. Dominika hesitated for a moment. Then she went to the bedroom she and Sławek shared and returned with a shoebox. She set it on the table in my garden room, as if the kitchen had suddenly ceased to be a stage where you could act out your old roles. The box contained envelopes, some open, some unopened. Some had Sławek's name on them, others Dominika's. A few had my home address. I also saw one envelope with Leokady's name, referring to her apartment. Everything was jumbled, as if someone had tried to cover the tracks with paper. Sławek sat on the edge of the bed, took the envelopes one by one, and read. His face changed with each page. Shame, disbelief, anger, and then something worse. Recognition. "Did you know?" I asked. He didn't answer immediately. "About the part," he finally said. "I knew about the guarantee. I thought the matter had died down because my friend had said he was paying it off. Things don't quiet down because you stop listening," I replied. He nodded as if he'd taken a blow without batting an eye. Dominika leaned against the wall, and I made an even bigger mess of it. She said it because instead of telling the truth, I started financing it. First with mom's money, then with your peace of mind, then with your room. Leokadia entered the room quietly. She must have heard everything from the hallway. She sat down on a chair by the door and looked as if she'd aged more overnight than in years. "And my apartment?" she asked her daughter. "Was that money really going to this?" Dominika closed her eyes. "Some of the rest went to patching things up, in installments, on pretending." Leokadia averted her face. She wasn't crying. Perhaps she'd run out of tears. Or maybe she'd realized that tears aren't a currency you can pay with anywhere. I went to the table and arranged the envelopes into 3 piles. Sławka's, Dominika's, Leokadia's. My stack was the smallest, but the heaviest, because it contained documents about the house and attempts to use my address as a cover. "Listen to me carefully." I said it. "I won't pay off your advice. I won't give up my room. I won't contribute to Leokadia's apartment, where someone else is paying rent. And I won't pretend that because you're all suffering, my suffering should disappear for the sake of balance." Sławek looked up. "I'm not asking you for money." "Good, because I would have refused." Quote, I said it without cruelty. Maybe that's why it sounded so strong. "Tomorrow," I continued, "each of you will call the appropriate places. You will establish your obligations. Leokadia will return to her apartment and her tenant. Dominika will stop managing other people's money. You, Sławek, will stop burying your head in other people's decisions. And I will return to my garden room." Dominika looked at me in disbelief. "Will you come back?" "Yes, but not to your house, to her own." That sentence changed the air in the room. Sławek lowered his head. Dominika remained silent. Leokadia whispered something I couldn't hear. Perhaps a prayer, or perhaps a curse at my own stupidity. I took all the envelopes from the box that pertained to my house and put them in my briefcase. Then I picked up the keys from the cabinet by the door. I didn't give them to Sławek. I didn't put them in my pocket right away either. I placed them in my own hand and said, "The keys will return to me. The door will be opened by whomever I allow. Not because I want to punish, because for years you've confused my love with access." Sławek stood up, tears in his eyes, but this time he didn't try to use them. "Mom, do I still have any way to get back to you?" I looked at him for a long time. I saw the boy with the broken mirror and the man who had allowed his mother to become a tenant in his own life. Both were real. I couldn't erase either of them from my mind. Quote, "Here," I said, "but without shortcuts through my wallet, my house, and my forgiveness. You'll have to follow the usual path of deeds." That evening, I stayed home longer. Mrs. Eulalia and I rehung the curtain in my room. It was crumpled but clean. Sławek put away the books. Leokadia packed the rest of her things from the room after the antonym and moved them to the hallway. Dominika sat at the table, writing a list of phone calls she would make the next day. I didn't trust her list, but I didn't have to. From now on, there would be confirmations, copies, and boundaries. As I closed the window, I saw hollyhocks in the garden, bowed after the rain. They had survived, even though no one had propped them up recently. I thought that maybe sometimes people look broken, but they're really just waiting for someone to stop hanging other people's coats on them. When I left for the night at Mrs. Boguslava's, I took my keys with me for the last time. On the threshold, I looked back at the house, and for the first time in days, I didn't feel like I was leaving. I felt like I was returning. Only not everyone understood yet that tomorrow there would be no return to the old order. I returned home in the morning with a small bag and keys in my coat pocket. I no longer carried my briefcase like a shield, though I had it with me. Paper was necessary, but something else was more important that day. The way I would set foot on the threshold. Not like a guest, not like a mother summoned to put out other people's fires, like a woman who had quietly left, only to return without being asked. The house was quiet, too quiet for a place where not long ago everyone spoke at the expense of others. Sławek sat in the kitchen. Envelopes, a notebook, and a pen lay before him. His face was tired, but he didn't look away. I called, he said before I took off my coat. Quote, to everyone, these are my and Dominika's matters, not yours. I nodded. Good. I couldn't have praised him more. In the past, I would have made tea. She patted his shoulder and said the most important thing was that he was trying. Now I knew that an adult wasn't rewarded for stopping hurting others. Leocadia was in the hallway, dressed to go out. Her bags were neatly stacked by the door, as if to conceal the mess of the last few months with this order. Quote, I'm going to my cousin's for a few days, she said quietly. Then I'll sort out my apartment. The tenant has a contract. I won't throw him out suddenly. But that's no longer your problem. He should never be mine, I replied. She lowered her head. Quote, I know. For a moment, we looked at each other without hostility, but also without warmth. That was fair too. Not every story ends with a hug. Sometimes the best reconciliation is when people stop taking from each other. Leocadia took my blanket from her bag, the one she'd been sitting under in the living room like a housewife. Quote, I washed it, she said. I don't know if that's right, because you probably have your own way. I took the blanket. It smelled of soap, not her perfume. Quote, thank you. That one word was enough. She left slowly, without her cane, which she'd left leaning against the wall. She only noticed it at the gate. She turned around but didn't return. Sławek carried the cane to her porch and handed it to her without a word. That small image stayed with me. A woman who had feigned weakness, walking away with an object that had previously been meant to protect her from the truth. Dominika hadn't left the room. I could hear her pacing nervously, opening drawers, closing her suitcase, opening it again. When she finally reached the kitchen, she looked different. Not poor, not remorseful, just without her former sharp exterior, like a piece of furniture whose shine had been stripped and the cracked wood had revealed. Quote, I'm leaving today too, she said. Sławek closed his eyes, as if he already knew the phrase, but it still stung. Quote, where to? I asked. To a friend. I'll see later. I didn't ask if it was true. From that day on, her truth was no longer my responsibility to guard. She placed an envelope on the table. Inside was the second installment of money from Leocadia, confirmation of a change in the account number for the tenant and a note written in Dominika's hand. I read it slowly. It contained an apology. Not beautiful, not soft, not the kind you frame, but specific, for the rent, for the room, for the announcement, for the wedding ring, for calling me unstable. At the end, she added, I was most afraid that you would leave and everyone would see how many things had happened just because you were silent. That sentence was closest to the truth of all I heard from her. I assume you wrote it. I said. Let's leave forgiveness for a time that will no longer be your currency. Dominika pursed her lips but didn't answer. She picked up her suitcase. At the door, she paused and looked at the kitchen. I thought that if I managed everything, no one would notice that I was afraid. Managing other people's lives isn't courage, I replied, it's noise. She left without slamming the door, without a final insult, and maybe that's why the house breathed a sigh of relief. I stayed with Sławek. For a long time, we didn't say anything. He sat at the table. I stood at the sideboard, running my finger over the mugs. I placed my chaber in front. Not for show. I don't know if the marriage will last, he finally said, it's your life. He looked at me with pain. In the past, you would have told me what to do. In the past, I confused love with saving you from every outcome. He rested his elbows on the table. Can I stay a while? Not as the owner. Not as the one who decides, as the son who has to clean up. I went to the cabinet by the door and took his keychain. I unclipped it from the pantry key, my room key, and the front door key. I left him only the gate key. I placed it on the table. Quote, you can come and go. You can't go everywhere. He looked at that one key for a long time, then nodded. I understand. Not yet, but you can learn. That day, I returned to the garden room for good. I hung the curtains, put up a picture of Antony, placed his wedding ring in a bowl, and unpacked my books. I removed the strange smells from his room, but I didn't turn it into a museum. I opened the window, wiped down the radio, and placed a green notebook on the desk. That evening, I sat in the kitchen alone. For the first time in a long time, no one told me how much things cost. No one counted my tea, the light above the table, or the window seat. Behind the wall, Sławek was arranging his papers in a box, and every now and then I heard him put down another envelope. He didn't call me, didn't ask for help. It was his first real tidying up. A few days later, a note arrived from Leocati. She wrote that she had spoken honestly with the tenant, that the money was already going into her account, and that she wouldn't be coming back to my house. There was one sentence at the end: "You only heat someone else's roof if you don't take away the landlord's space by the stove." I didn't reply immediately. Maybe someday. Nothing more came from Dominika. I only learned from Sławek that she had started talking to the companies she had previously been afraid of, and that for the first time, she hadn't used the word family as a cover. It didn't make her good, but maybe it made her even a little more responsible. And I stayed. Not because I won the house. The house was always mine. I won something harder. The right not to have to explain my presence. Sometimes in the evening I sit by the window, watching the hollyhocks, and I remember that rainy morning, the rent note, and Dominika's fingernail tapping against the signature line. Then I think my revenge wasn't about screaming, or humiliating them, or taking everything away from them. It was about leaving quietly, letting everyone hear their lies squeak loudly without my silence. Panic only set in when there was no old woman left to blame. And peace came to me when I realized I didn't have to pay rent for a room in the house I'd paid for with my heart my whole life. Yeah,